Right, hey everyone, I'm Klloo. So, it's time once again to approach the subject of cost, right? So, what it costs to play Flesh and Blood at all different levels, and obviously this topic is very, very subjective, right? Everyone's welcome to their own opinion about, what the price range should be from getting into the game to building a decent quality deck to obviously then competing at the highest level of Flesh and Blood. But I think something to obviously note in regards to that is that we are continuing on this upward trend, right? Nothing is being alleviated by any sense, and obviously the releases of the Hunted and High Seas itself has been mired by some other issues, right? It's been in heavy demand and it hasn't been printed to the adequate nature of the community growth, and that's no fault of LSS, right? So they are a small company. Everything that they do from a manufacturing standpoint is done well in advance, so they couldn't really account for the growth of the game. But I think something to just put in perspective is we got a set of beautiful articles by LSS and by some fantastic players of Flesh and Blood, sort of as a standard, if you will, of what you should aim for when trying to build a real competitive variant of Marlin, Puffin, and Gravy. So if you haven't read those articles, the 0 to 80 articles, definitely go check them out. But something that especially new players might find a little bit alarming is if you actually look into getting something equivalent to that deck, the price tag associated to it is quite hefty. Now, when it comes to how pricing works, there are 4 sort of factors that impact the cost of Flesh and Blood to me. The first one is the meta, right? So what is currently being played, what cards are in the highest demand. So we're going to shelf that because that's a little bit harder to quantify, if you will, and it's ever changing. So the 3 that we're going to focus on are essentially the P's of products, right? Print run, price, and pull rates. So how did High Seas do? Well, not so good. So the product basically sold out, right? It ended up exceeding the MSRP across all areas, right? And it has the second worst overall Majestic rate, right, than that any set in Flesh and Blood has had. So altogether, these 3 factors compound to make a real sort of awful time when it comes to, again, trying to pick up some of these cards, especially then we tie in timing, right? So High Seas is released a month out from big major events, so everyone is clamoring for these new cards, and prices are definitely inflated at the moment, right? So again, these factors aren't horrendous, right? And they are, to some extent, outside LSS's control, right? So the product being sold out, again, that goes back to LSS and the print run that they decided for High Seas was indicative of last year's community size, right? And then since the Hunted, we've had a lot of growth in the game, which is fantastic to see, but obviously LSS couldn't account for that adequately, right? So we have been promised that the final set of the year, so the set following High Seas, not the Mastery Pack Guardian, but the actual standard or normal traditional set. What do we have a term for that yet? Right? Whatever it is, the final set of the year should be adequate, which is hopefully correct, right? And a beautiful thing to see. So that should obviously alleviate supply and demand. Now, in terms of MSRP, it sort of goes hand in hand, of course, with whether or not the product sells out. So if the product's in high demand, then obviously the price is going to go up. But something else to reference when it comes to MSRP. So I know in Canada or in America, you have the unilateral pricing, right? So it used to be the minimum standard pricing or whatever the shorthand for it, but now it's the unilateral pricing. We don't have that here in Australia. So in terms of pricing, we were well below MSRP, right? But with High Seas, we've hit it and then we've exceeded it. So another thing to sort of bear in mind is come whatever the final set of the year is, I can't see it regressing back to what pricing was prior to High Seas, right? I would sort of assume that the majority of retailers are now going to stick at MSRP or within MSRP to some degree. So that is again, no fault of LSS, and especially no fault of stores. It is a luxury that we have, as the consumers, have had for the longest time, being able to pick up products so cheaply, right? So let's start breaking some of this down in terms of numbers, right? So the first thing to really look at for me personally when it comes to the print run is equivalency. So for instance, when Welcome to Rathe was printed, it had a certain amount of pull rates. It had a certain pool of cards. So for instance, Welcome to Rathe by this chart, 100,000, right? If its print run was 100,000, it's equal to 100,000. As we've slowly grown as a game, pull rates have been tweaked, card pools have increased. So altogether, the effective print run is actually below that of the actual realistic print run, right? So for High Seas, for instance, a print run of 100,000 booster displays would only really be equivalent to 74,000. That is quite the factor, right? Because that, to me, is something that I don't think LSS has actually factored in when it comes to print runs when looking at the trends of products, right? So, for instance, say High Seas had a print run of 250,000, which I think is a fair estimate, then adjusted in terms of card populations, right, and actually the total population of play pieces available to the community, this would actually be equivalent to 184,000 booster displays, right? Again, going off of the pull rates and what essentially Welcome to Rathe or previous sets have supplied in terms of, again, of play pieces for the community. So, that is a substantial difference in essentially depreciating the actual print run. So what we get for the following set of the year, if pull rates and card pools stay as they are, is again going to not actually reflect its actual size. And that is definitely something that's a little bit of a concern. So to put this in easier to understand numbers, Welcome to Rathe. It took 3.75 cases to supply a playset of non-foil Majestic cards, right? So every non-foil Majestic in the set to have a playset of 3 or 1, depending if... I don't think there was any legendary keywords. It wasn't till Klloo with Golgarian Tome, correct? Right? So, yeah, it took 3.75 cases of Welcome to Rathe per playset of Majestic. Now, for High Seas, it takes 5 cases. So that, again, is quite the difference. It means that we as a community have to open more product to, again, supply the same amounts of playsets of cards as, again, those earlier sets. So this compounded with the fact that, again, we have seen a price increase. So to add in pricing, right, a case price of Welcome to Rathe was $575 recommended retail pricing, right? Now for High Seas, it's at $700. I'm using AUD because, again, we don't have a minimum or a unilateral pricing, right? So not only have I been a part of this market, but our market pricing is definitely a little bit more turbulent than some other areas, right? So overall, this marks a 22% increase in terms of just pricing. But again, if we then factor in the fact that we now have to open an extra case, essentially, of a set to, again, supply the same amount of cards, that's where an issue sort of definitely starts to amount. Now, until High Seas, on average, a case was about $480. So even for the Hunted, right, I picked up cases for, at most, around $480, right? So I do shop around and I buy from a bunch of different places. So yeah, I've paid above that and I've probably paid below that. But, right, overall, from that perspective, and again, this was a luxury that we, the consumers, had, that's a 45% increase in price, right? So again, all these things then add up to essentially exert more strain on the secondary market and the price of singles. Now, this chart, right, it reflects the amount of product that was needed to open per playset of Majestic. So again, essentially that case amount, right? So we can see Welcome to Rathe starting at the lower left, and then with High Seas, we've gone up quite rapidly, right? But High Seas was the second worst. So Rosetta, actually going through the numbers, had the worst rate of Majestics. And I don't necessarily like saying rates because the actual pack rate of a Majestic has not drastically changed. So Welcome to Rathe to Outsiders, right, was 1 in 4. Well, actually Outsiders was 1 in 5, right? And then once we got the expansion slots, we sort of saw the 1 in 4 rate be split between the expansion slots and the limited Majestics, and then basically amount to 1 in 4 overall. So it's not necessarily the rate that has been drastically affected, it's the card pool, right, if you will, that has increased and has led to, again, a higher amount of product being needed per playset of Majestic. So overall, without factoring in the price, this marks a 35% increase. If we then take, again, that 22% increase in pricing, it amounts to a 59% increase when compared to Welcome to Rathe, right? So that is, again, pretty drastic and something that I do hope is accurately accounted for when it does come to whatever the new adjustments to print runs are. Now, to get into the specifics, right, of the Majestics, so here we have a nice chart, right, that indicates essentially, again, the packs per playset of pulling all the Majestics in a set. Right, now I have tried my best to account for short printing. If the short printing amount was unspecified, which it is basically for, I think, Bright Lights was the last set, we actually got a number, right, but we only got it for Max V, I believe, because that was a reprint in the set. So weapons and equipment have featured anywhere from 60% to 75% less frequent, and then the legendary keyword anywhere from, I believe, 40 to 60%. So essentially, I've taken the highest amounts which will present more favorably as well for the set. So, for instance, take High Seas, the limited Majestic count is 33, but then the adjusted amount per short prints is only 27.6 Majestics, right? So if I were to use, say, 50% for the legendary keyword for all the amulets, that'd be 28.5. So it would go up, which means that the overall amount of packs per playset would also go up. So yeah, I've done my best to, again, count for short printing, but as we can see, since the expansion slot has come out, we have been in the red, right? So Outsiders, again, featured at a rate of 1 in 5. I don't know why that changed. I don't know if there was ever a reason on the side. I think maybe it was the dual class cards, right? So, they were essentially worth 1.5 because they slotted into 2 decks. But then with Bright Lights, I don't believe the limited Majestic rate changed. We just got the expansion slot Majestics on top of it. But from heavy hitters onwards, we have seen a decrease in limited Majestics, right, from 1 in 4 to 1 in 5.88, with the expense slot Majestics at a rate of 1 in 12.5 packs. So this has led to, again, that increase in the amount of packs per playset. So Rosetta making it the highest set when it comes to the amount of product that needs to be opened per playset, and then High Seas. So overall, we will definitely be seeing a correction of print runs. We probably won't see any huge adjustment or rebound, if you will, when it comes to pricing of products. I, again, would assume that we sit around MSRP a little bit closer nowadays, which, again, is absolutely fine. That's what the product should go for. That's essentially the margins being advertised to stores, so they're completely within their rights to sell products at MSRP. But what I do hope is that LSS do course correct Majestics, because, again, we're just continuing on this upward trend, and that will have continued strain on the game. And we see have continued strain on the game. I think Gravy being just a top pick when it comes to a playable hero for all the major events coming up has reflected that greatly, right? When it comes to his Majestics, as opposed to that of Marlin or Puffin in terms of pricing. Because that's the other thing. As the card pool goes up, so for High Seas, again, there's 33 Majestics, right? Obviously, not all of the Majestics are equivalent, so we have that skewing where X Majestic absorbs the pricing overall. But because of that greater pool, again, a greater amount of product has to be opened, which means a greater amount of money has to be spent, right, on product. Again, 3.75 cases for Watery Graves, Dark Angel Rising, to now 5 cases for High Seas. So when it comes to, again, an actual, real, playable, meta-relevant hero straight out the gate, which we saw definitely in Rosetta and definitely in more so Misfail, right? It does impact the value. So I really do hope that LSS do make an active change to Majestics. But again, that would be the bottom of the list to me, right? Pricing is what pricing is. The only thing that's directly in LSS's rearview mirror to fix is obviously the print run, right? And accounting for accurate community growth of the game. So, with that in mind, the other thing to then talk about is Legendaries, because Legendaries don't have a problem. So, Legendaries are one of the other big play pieces of the game, right? So, I'm someone who does subscribe, if you will, to a clearer separation of just having play pieces readily available, right? And then having the bigger, fancier chase variants. So when it comes to Legendaries, they have sort of stayed the path, right? And definitely been a lot better than the trend of Majestics. So even though there's some red on this table, then we put it in a bit better perspective. So Watery Graves all the way to Tales of Aria, right, was the previous model of Fab of Unlimited First Edition. Then Uprising, we got Fab 2.0, and basically Cold Falls and Rainbow Fall Legendaries being side by side. So we get a combined rate when it comes to pulling a legendary for Uprising, Outsiders, and Bright Lights. Now, from heavy hitters onwards, we've only been disclosed the Rainbow Foil legendary pull rate of 1 in 96, which makes it equivalent to, again, those earlier sets, but realistically it is going to be below 1 in 96 if we knew what the cold foil rate was, right? If we were to say cold foil was 1 in 360 packs, so 15 boxes, which is a pretty high estimate, it would bring this number down to 1 in 75 packs, right? Which would make it slightly more than Bright Lights, but again, with the actual card pool of Legendaries, equivalent or less than that of Watery Graves and Arcane Rising, right? So for me, there's no change to Legendaries, and Legendaries are in a much healthier spot. Maybe less so when it comes to maybe a generic Legendary, right? So maybe some sense of tweaking and understanding that, this card slots into everything, this card slots into 1 or 2 things, so that should probably have some discrepancy to it, right? But overall, I think the simplest thing to do is obviously just increase the amount of Majestics we are pulling. So that brings me finally to the next product, right? Our little mini set, Mastery Pack Guardian. So this is essentially half a set. It has 3 Legendaries, 16 Majestics, and 1 box is only 12 packs. So by all metrics, it is basically half a set, right? Now, the USD price and the Euro price is under half that of a booster box of the normal set. In other regions, the price is around half to slightly above, right? But what I really, really want to note and see with Mastery Pack Guardian is if they do tweak the Majestic rates, right? So fingers crossed it stays at 1 in 4 packs, right? Which is, again, the stock standard rate that we always have had for Majestics. Again, nowadays, split between limited Majestics, expansion slot Majestics. Mastery Pack Guardian doesn't have an expansion slot. So fingers crossed it stays at 1 in 4. But what this would actually mean is the packs per playset would only be about 180, right? Which would put it under that. If we compared it to a normal set, essentially, if we doubled it, right, it'd be 360, which is equivalent to Weapon Wraith and Arcane Rising, but under every set that we have nowadays. So I could actually see LSS tweaking the Majestic rate, and I would kind of feel sad by that, right, because it would sort of be an indication that there is no desire to correct the course of Majestics, and Majestics will always have that duality of being a big portion when it comes to the value of a box, rather than the collectible variants, right? Again, I always state this, but Rainbow Falls are 1 in 18, right? They're roughly 3 times that of a normal Majestic, but the price will never, apparently, reflect that. So if they do tweak the Majestic rate, if it was 1 in 5 packs for Mastery Pack Guardian, put it at 225 packs per playset of Majestics, and this would be more around equivalent to current sets, so that would be okay. But worst case scenario is they make it 1 in 6 packs, which put it around 270 packs per playset, which would then put it over the pack per playset rates of current sets, which would be definitely a little bit disheartening, right? But it would be in line with current limited Majestics, again, being at around 1 in 5.88 packs. So, yeah, there we have it. We're hoping for course correction, and I will personally be using Mastery Pack Guardian as some level of indication towards that, but overall, we know that they are going to correct the print runs and the supply, right, to adequately reflect community growth. I don't expect pricing to drastically rebound. So we had a similar case when it came to Monarch, right, when Monarch was definitely overestimated, right? So Monarch First Edition, I think here in Australia, it was like climbed to $400 a booster box. So well over double recommended retail pricing. But obviously once we got the proper understanding of the print run, along with Tales and Everfest, it dropped well below recommended retail pricing. I think for the longest time back then, boxes were 100 to 120 AUD, right? So yeah, personally, I don't expect, and I don't necessarily think it should, drop again well below recommended retail pricing, but should hover around that a bit more consistently come the final set of the year. So again, the big one on the table, I personally would like to see tweaked, is Majestics, right? They are the core play piece of Flesh and Blood. Every set we get, there's an overall higher rates of Majestics in the deck, right? Although it does seem they've sort of pulled back on how many generics they deliver in a set, so that's one thing. But overall, I would like to see them rein in Majestic pull rates a little bit, right? Anyway, let me know what you think. Hope you enjoyed. See ya.